The sound of chains, the crack of a whip, then silence. Under the blistering sun of Texas, a young girl stood barefoot on the wooden platform, her wrists bound by rusted iron. The crowd stared at her like they were choosing livestock. The auctioneer grinned. Sweat ran down his neck. Even 4 years after the Civil War ended slavery, shadowy auctions like this still thrived in hidden barns, where desperate folks were sold off like old debts to evade the law. Next one, 17, no husband, no family. Been sold 3 times already, won't talk, won't work, $5 to start. In a time when folks valued strong backs for farm labor, a silent girl like her seemed useless, too broken by the war's aftermath to fetch more than a few coins. No one spoke. A man in the front spat in the dirt. Not worth a single dime. The girl's name was Lena Cartwright. Her dress hung in tatters, dust clinging to her skin, her hair stuck to her face, hiding the bruise on her cheek. She stared at the ground, unmoving. She had stopped crying long ago. Crying never changed anything here. Then a voice, calm, deep, steady. "I'll pay 20. Heads turned. At the back of the crowd, a man in a faded brown coat stood with a handful of crumpled bills. His name was Grant McCade, 56 years old. Gray stubble on his jaw, a man who looked like he hadn't smiled in a decade. The auctioneer blinked. $20, you sure? Mr. Grant nodded once. The gavel slammed down. Sold. Lena didn't move. She didn't even look at him. Grant stepped closer, pulling off his hat. When he saw her face clearly, his heart stopped. That scar, a small crescent on her wrist, 8 years ago. He had wrapped that wound himself. He remembered the little girl hiding behind her father's leg, asking if it would leave a mark. He had told her no. He had lied. The auctioneer shoved Lena forward. Grant caught her before she fell. Her skin was burning hot. She looked up at him for the first time, her eyes green but hollow. He whispered her name. Lena. Her expression didn't change. A flicker crossed her eyes like a half-buried memory from before the war stole everything, but she pushed it down. Folks in her shoes learned fast not to trust old faces. She didn't remember him, or maybe she did, and wished she didn't. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the gavel echoing again. Another life sold, another soul gone. Grant counted his last coins, placed them in the man's palm, and walked away with the girl who hadn't spoken in years. Grant didn't. The dirt road stretched out under a merciless sky. Lena walked a few steps behind him, her chains clinking softly. Every sound reminded him of what he owed. He didn't know if she'd ever understand why he did this. Maybe she never would. But as the barn door slammed shut behind them, he felt the past breathing down his neck. 8 years ago, his father's greed had condemned the Cartwright family. And now, the last piece of that family walked beside him, silent, broken, and alive. The sun dipped lower, dust rose around their feet. Grant knew the ghosts of that day would follow him until he told her the truth. But how do you ask forgiveness from someone who doesn't even know who you are? The road stretched for miles, dust rising under the horses' hooves. Right after they left the barn, Grant stopped the horses, pulled a key from his pocket, and unlocked her chains. No one should wear these in a free country, he muttered, thinking of the Union soldiers' promises after the war. The sun beat down hard, baking the dirt until it cracked. Grant rode slow. The girl behind him on a smaller mare, silent, head bowed, no sound but the steady clink of the chains still locked around her wrist. He could feel her fear like heat. Every time he looked back, she stared at the ground, never at him. They stopped near a big oak tree, its shade the only cool spot for miles. Grant climbed down, tied the horses, and pulled a small canteen from his saddlebag. He walked over, careful not to get too close. "Here," he said softly. She hesitated, watching him like he might strike her. Finally, she reached for it, her fingers trembling. She gripped the canteen tight, her eyes narrowing like she'd seen too many false kindnesses since the war ended, sizing him up before letting her guard drop. She took one sip, wiped her mouth, and then looked straight at him for the first time. Her voice was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through bone. "Guess you got what you paid for," she said. do what you want." Grant froze. For a long moment, he didn't breathe. The words stung worse than a bullet. He knelt down slowly, making sure she could see his hands were empty. "I didn't buy you to own you," he said. "I just didn't want to see them sell you again." She let out a bitter laugh, short and dry. "You think that makes it better?" He didn't answer. There was no answer that would sound right. They sat there in the heat, the silence stretching between them. Grant stared at his boots, the dust sticking to the sweat on his hands. "I knew your family," he said finally. "Your father was a good man. I should have done more when they came for him." Lena turned her face away. Her voice was flat. "Everybody says that after it's too late." The wind picked up. Shaking the branches above them, she stood, still holding the canteen, and started walking back to her horse. Grant didn't stop her. He just watched, knowing he'd earned every ounce of her anger. Grant put his hat back on and followed. The sound of hooves echoed over the hills, steady and hollow, like a heartbeat trying to remember its rhythm. He wondered how many miles it would take before she stopped seeing him as the enemy, or if she ever would. And somewhere in that silence, one thought kept burning. What would she do when she learned the truth? By the time they reached the ranch, the sun was sliding behind the hills. The land stretched quiet and empty, a place where even the wind seemed tired. Grant untied the horses, handed Lena a crust of bread, and showed her the small cabin. "Inside," he said simply. She hesitated, eyes darting to the single bed and the cold stove. Then she stepped in, slow, careful, like a stray dog testing the floor. For a few days, the ranch stayed silent. Lena worked without a word, feeding the horses, hauling water, scrubbing the floor until her hands cracked. Grant fixed fences, mended the roof, and tried not to watch her too closely. They lived like two ghosts sharing the same ground. But out here, silence never lasted long. On the third day, 3 riders came up the road. Grant saw the dust first, then the glint of a badge catching sunlight. Sheriff Dalton, the man who had once called himself protector of justice, the same man who led soldiers to burn the Cartwright farm to ash. Dalton dismounted, slow, smirking. "Well, if it ain't Grant McCade." His eyes slid past Grant and landed on the girl standing behind the fence. He squinted at the scar on her wrist, the one from that fateful night 8 years back. And his smirk faded for a split second. Old secrets from the war days didn't stay buried easy in these parts. "Now that's a face I thought I'd never see again." Lena froze. Her knuckles whitened around the wooden rail. Grant stepped between them. "You've had your look," he said quietly. Dalton laughed. "You buying lost girls now, Grant? Or is she here to keep you warm at night?" Grant didn't flinch, but the air changed, the kind of silence that came right before a gunshot. "I paid for her freedom," Grant said, his voice low and steady. "Not her body." Dalton took a slow step forward, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Well, that's mighty noble of you. But you see, I remember that name, Cartwright. Her daddy was a traitor. Remember, it was the same old lie he'd spun to justify the raid, calling honest farmers traitors to the Union cause, just to grab their land in the chaos after Appomattox." Lena's breath hitched. She gripped the rail harder, her mind flashing back to the flames that night, wanting to spit the truth at him, but knowing silence had kept her alive this long in a world still healing from the war. Grant's jaw tightened. "She's under my protection," he said. Dalton chuckled, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a single bullet. He placed it on the fence post between them. "A reminder. Grant," he said softly, "some ghosts don't stay buried." When they finally rode off, the dust they left behind felt heavier than before. Lena picked up the bullet and turned it in her hand. "Who was that?" she asked quietly. Grant didn't answer. Not yet. He just looked out toward the fading sun. The memory of fire and screams still burned into his mind, because he knew this wasn't over, and when Dalton came back, blood would follow. "If you've stayed with me this far, pour yourself a cup of tea, sit back, and breathe with the story. Tell me, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from? And if you want to know what happens when the truth finally comes out, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter." That night, the wind blew harder than usual. the kind that carried the smell of rain and old memories. Grant sat by the small fire in the cabin, the light dancing on the rough wood walls. Lena sat across from him, silent as ever, her face half hidden in shadow. Neither had spoken since Dalton's visit, but silence has a way of forcing truth out. After a while, Lena reached into her pocket and placed something on the table. A small silver pocket watch, old and worn, the initials R.A. faintly carved on its back. She pushed it toward him. "Recognize it?" she asked quietly. Grant's hand froze in midair. He did recognize it. Robert Cartwright. Her father? "I found it in a bag left behind after the raid," she said. "I kept it 8 years, hiding it. Every time they sold me to a new house, I made sure no one ever touched it. It was the last thing Pa gave me before the soldiers came." Whispering, "Keep this safe, Lena," a reminder of the family the war tore apart like so many across the South. She looked up at him, her eyes sharp but wet. "You knew him, didn't you?" Grant swallowed hard. His voice came out rough. "I did." Lena leaned forward. "Then tell me the truth. What really happened that night?" Grant stared at the flames for a long time. They flickered, twisted, like ghosts dancing. He finally spoke, each word slow and heavy. "My father sold out your family for their land after the war. I overheard him telling the soldiers. I rode to warn your pa, but it was too late. Everything was burning. I was a coward. I lived, and they didn't." Lena said nothing. She reached for the watch and closed her hand around it, her knuckles white. Her fingers shook, like she wanted to hurl it into the fire and forget, but the memories held on tight, echoes of a pre-war life when families like hers dreamed of a better America. "You think telling me this makes it better?" she asked. "No," he said softly. "It doesn't, but you deserve to know who you're standing next to." For a long time, they just sat there, the fire hissing between them, outside. Thunder rolled over the hills, like the earth remembering what they tried to forget. Lena finally spoke again, voice almost a whisper. "If your father did all that, why are you the one carrying the guilt?" Grant looked up, his eyes tired but steady. "'Cause I was there. 'Cause I did nothing. And because I'm still breathing when they're not." The fire cracked once more. Lena looked at him, and for the first time since they met, her anger seemed to falter. Not gone, just cracked, like something inside her was trying to understand. But before she could speak again, a sound broke through the storm outside, the sound of hooves, fast, close. Grant reached for his gun because sometimes the past doesn't knock twice. The sound of hooves faded into the distance, leaving only the crackle of the dying fire. Grant stood by the door, gun still in hand, eyes locked on the rain pouring outside. Lena sat near the hearth, the silver watch still clutched tight. Neither spoke, but the silence was different now, not cold, not angry, and just heavy with everything that had been said. When morning came, the storm was gone, the sky was washed clean, soft light spilling over the ranch. Grant went out to fix the broken fence, his hands steady, his back aching from years of work and regret. He didn't hear Lena at first, not until she spoke behind him. "You're doing it wrong." Her tone was dry, almost teasing. He turned. She was holding the hammer, her hair messy, her dress still damp from the rain. Without another word, she came over and started helping him. They worked side by side for hours, no talking, just the sound of wood and wind. And somehow, in that quiet rhythm, something began to change. Not love, not yet, but something that felt close to peace. After that confession night, Grant started carving simple wooden boards, figuring Lena deserved a spot to honor her kin like the memorials popping up across the states for war's lost souls. Later that evening, Grant built 2 small wooden crosses near the fence line. He carved the names by hand, one for Robert Cartwright and one simply marked family. When Lena saw it, her eyes filled with tears she had held for 8 long years. She knelt beside the graves, tracing the letters with her fingertips. Then she stood, walked up to him, and placed the watch back into his hand. "I think it's time you keep it," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, it belongs to them." She smiled. Small and tired, but real. "Then let it stay here." That night, She didn't sleep in the corner by the door. She sat by the window instead, watching the stars, and Grant, sitting across the room, finally felt like he could breathe again. Days turned into weeks. Lena stayed. She mended clothes, planted seed, and handed him a plank when he stumbled in the mud one day. Small acts building trust, like families rebuilding after the war, little by little. The ghost that haunted that ranch began to fade. Maybe forgiveness doesn't come in a single moment. Maybe it grows, the way grass pushes through burned soil, quiet and slow. And maybe that's what healing really is. If you've ever carried a guilt too heavy to name,